What's up, everyone? How are you? How is your day? How is your week coming along? It is Thursday, and I've got a guest. I love having guests. I really do. I love talking to people and finding out more about them or what they do or really why they think the way they think. And today I have a guest that Eliza Blue actually reached out and she mentioned I should definitely interview this guy. You definitely got to get Ace on your show. And I was like, all right, let me reach out to Ace. And the day has finally come. Ace, welcome to the show. How you doing, sir?
Oh, thank you, Adam. Thank you so much for bringing me on. This is a pleasure.
Yeah, it's my pleasure, honestly. I love having conversations and talking to new people, So this
Mhm.
this is actually the first time we've ever
Yeah.
talked, and I like your takes. I've been following you on Twitter
Oh, thank you.
since Eliza was like, "Yo, you gotta talk to this guy. He's great." So yeah, if Eliza says that, I'm like, "All right, yeah,
That was
I
very
really,
kind of her.
yeah."
Yeah, that was great.
She's a good human being, that's for sure.
Mhm.
So the reason she said you got to talk to Ace is she started talking about how she's finding herself to be a little bit more anarcho-capitalistic. And there's a huge misconception when people hear anarchy.
Oh,
Suddenly
yeah.
they're like buildings on fire, guns being shot in the air, pow, 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 like, just because anarchy, and I'll be honest, that's kind of what I thought too.
Oh, yeah.
Anarchy is like the absence of law.
Right.
Um, and is that actually wrong, or is that actually still kind of accurate without the violence?
Well, in some sense, it's both, right? Because like words can have multiple meanings, right? So in
Right.
some sense, when someone talks about anarchy meaning chaos, they're right from their perspective of the meaning of that word. But the word also has another more philosophical connotation that does not necessarily mean the absence of law.
Okay.
Oftentimes, when anarchists talk about anarchism, they're actually proposing a norm or a law. They're saying that. Each person, really the basis of anarchism, if we can get into that a little bit, the basis of anarchism ultimately, in my view, and I think I'm pulling from some earlier anarchist thinkers when I say this, which is that the anarchist view is that each person has the highest claim to their own life and property. And what that means is that if we are to interact morally speaking, most moral way to interact is voluntarily, right? I'm not forcing you to be here. You're not forcing me to be here. And we're coming together in a mutually beneficial arrangement right now.
Okay.
We both freely chose to be here. And because each person is their own sovereign, to use a word like that, that means that the anarchist is against domination from others, meaning people who encroach into the boundaries of another person or their property.
Okay. Yeah, that's putting it pretty plainly, and that
Mhm.
understand. So, I mean, what would the difference be with libertarianism? Because it that kind of sounds pretty similar to that. No government telling
Yeah.
the individual what they can or cannot do.
Mhm.
Is there much of a difference? Because from that, it doesn't seem like it.
Yeah, if we take libertarianism to mean the non-aggression principle, which is what I find the basis of libertarianism to be, the idea that kind of what I just said, no one has a right to initiate violence against another person or their property.
Okay.
You can use defensive violence, but that's different than initiating. Just wanted to throw that out there. But I think those are essentially the same thing. I think libertarianism and anarchism are kind of just two sides of the same coin there. If
Right.
we understand libertarianism to be that, yeah.
So that makes sense. So
Mhm.
so what is uh, you know now that you define anarchy, anarcho-capitalism.
Yeah.
So it's like, but true free market style of capitalism is
Yes.
what I would assume.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So Murray Rothbard, a libertarian anarchist thinker, really the kind of the who brought anarchism back in, or like individualist anarchism back into like the public zeitgeist, had this quote where he's like, anarchism fulfills capitalism and capitalism fulfills anarchism, which is that they're really in, if you to truly understand anarchism. And but I should note, there are other anarchists who are not anarcho-capitalists who are kind of like very skeptical of markets and like that. So
Okay.
I just want to point out that there are other anarchists, and I'm not trying to make it seem like anarchism is one monolithic like sect or just branch of philosophy. There's multiple different anarchists, but with that being said, I take the position that markets, in the sense, and by market all we mean is uh, like I have something that you want, and you have something that I want, and when we come to an interaction or an agreement to trade, we have engaged in a market activity because we both peacefully traded goods or services with each other without the use of violence, and we both gained value from this interaction because when I trade something with you and you trade something with me, I want your thing more than my thing, and you want my thing more than your thing. And then for when we trade, the value scales both get increased
Right.
from both of our perspectives. So it's a mutually beneficial arrangement.
I think a
Um,
lot of that skepticism that you're talking about comes from
mhm.
people who confuse capitalism and corporatism,
Oh
and
yes,
there being like these entities that don't give a shit about the individual, where
right.
like true free market is
Mhm.
all about supply and demand, and
Yeah,
not necessarily profit. Because like you said, when those two things come together, two individuals that trade, both profit.
both
It's like
profit. Yes,
both profit instead of just a
yes,
one-sided, lopsided
right.
business making money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And oftentimes when people talk about corporations, and like you talked about like corporate America, I think what a lot of people kind of don't really think about is the fact that most of these corporations have the power they do because of the state, right? Corporations love the government. This is
Oh
actually
yeah.
something that I think some people who might be a little bit inclined to markets might think, well, corporations must hate the government because there's all these regulations. But it's like, no, because the corporations can exist at a level where they can offset the cost of the regulations, whereas their competitors, who might be much smaller, cannot offset the cost of the government's regulations. So what that means is that these corporations can essentially become almost cartels in the market because they're benefiting from a captive market. They're not in a free market. If they were in a free market, many of these corporations we see today would have a much smaller market share because there'd be no government there to restrict competition, which is basically what the government does whenever there's a regulation in place on market activity. It's restricting
Mm.
competition from these corporations, which ultimately means that these corporations, this is why corporations lobby for regulations, right? Why
Of
does
course.
Walmart lobby for a minimum wage increase rather than just increasing the minimum wage in Walmart, right? They do
Right.
that to hurt their competitors. It's so that they can offset because they can actually afford to raise their minimum wage, but it's not but the point is they want to hurt their competitors at the same time rather than raising the minimum wage, their own minimum wage internally.
Yeah, if they're gonna do it, why not
Yeah,
screw over the smaller competitors so that
exactly.
they further ingrain themselves as like the sole, I don't want to say the sole source of what is Walmart? It's just a bunch of crap. I mean,
Yeah.
what you walk through Walmart and it's all Chinese made stuff that just sucks. The clothes fall apart. I mean, sure, there are some things in there that are quality,
Yeah.
they electronics, most electronics have like a bar that they have to be above,
Mhm.
or else, they don't even
Right.
sell. So but still, that I didn't even think about that. That
Mhm.
regulations in itself is just screwing over the small businesses, really.
Yes,
Like,
it's an attack on poor businesses or like
yeah,
lower income businesses. That's
wow,
all regulations ultimately are. And this is why corporations lobby for regulations, right? It wouldn't make it if corporations really were at odds with the government, they wouldn't lobby for their own destruction. But the
right,
ultimate point is regulations do not destroy these corporations. They embolden them because they reduce the competition on the outset,
wow.
on the marginalized businesses.
Well, how do we fix that?
Well, that's the question, isn't it?
Yeah,
um, well,
no,
I mean, in some sense, you could say, well, get rid of the government, but then that just gives you another question. Well, how do we do that, right? Which I think is a much broader question. Um,
yeah, my
yeah,
goodness. So look at where we are now.
yeah,
No, let's not even look at this day and age, like what's going on right now.
hmm
What How would like an anarcho capitalist, it sounds weird to say this, government
hmm
work? Like, is there a
sure.
government in that? Like, how would, if America was anarcho capitalist, what would the
hmm
government look like?
Yeah, I think that depends on what you mean by government, right? Which is like always so.
Okay.
Like, like if you just mean like the structure of how things operate, in some sense, then you could,
Mhm.
if you want to call that a government, then you could say there's an anarchist government. There could be an anarchist government, right? So I do think it's important to define the state before we like go further, because this is like ultimately the crux of why the anarchist is opposed to the state.
Okay.
So the state is a monopoly on legalized violence, right? So when we're defining things, we're trying to define them by their key features. We try to define them by features that this property possesses that another property doesn't. So
Mhm.
when we're looking at the state, we have to think of, okay, what makes it unique to all other institutions in society? And the one key defining feature is that it's the only institution in society which claims a legal right to use violence against you, or initiate violence against you legally, right? Any other institution in society or person in society who tried to do the things the state does would be thrown in prison. If you or I acted like a state agent, and went around, if I knocked on your door and said, give me your money, I'd like to give it away in your name, and I said, if you don't do it, I'm going to throw you in a cage, we would all be thrown in. I would be thrown in prison because of what I tried to do to you. But when the state does it, there's no consequences because they have declared themselves having the legal right to do this. So they claim a legal monopoly on lawmaking, essentially, and the right to initiate violence. That's the state's key feature. So the anarchist is not even trying to eliminate law necessarily, because there are some laws anarchists could support, like laws against murder, rape, theft, things that would bolster or support the principles of anarchism itself, right? So I think one thing it's important to disconnect is that law and the state merely co-opted and monopolized law. It did not create it. There's historical examples of law arising. English common law is one example where it's like that arose from the ground up just to like mediate disputes between parties. And it wasn't monopolized. It was something we call polycentric. It was there was no geographic entity that monopolized all of the common law arbiters all over the place and told them you have to follow this one set of law. So how it would sort of work is that you, in the same way that most of our interactions daily are already anarchist, right? If anarchism is, because anarchism comes from the Greek root or Greek word anarchos, which essentially means without rulers. So anarchism, plainly speaking, is the condition of not being ruled. So anytime you interact with another person where you're not being ruled, that's an anarchist relationship or an anarchist interaction. I
So
think
America was basically founded to be like anarchists then.
Not completely, no, because you still had with the, it was in certain semblances the government, like the Articles of Confederation, let's say before the Constitution, that
Mhm.
was certainly much closer to what anarchists would like than not. But I think the Constitution also centralized power to a large extent, going from
Okay.
the Articles to the Constitution. So the state still existed and still had a monopoly, but certainly as far as how, back to your main question, sorry, how it would exactly work is you would have, in the same way that you and I volunteer. So let's say, because most people get caught up on like legal and security, like what would happen, what about police, what about courts? These are usually the main hangups, right? So if I said, okay, you and I are in a dispute and we want to seek some resolution, we need to go to some arbiter to try to resolve the dispute, right? We could say, well, right now we would go to court or something, let's say, right? If we were having a contractual dispute or something, we might go to court. And we could say, well, there are problems with this because, there's also this, because the state is a monopoly, it suffers from the same incentive problems other monopolies suffer from, which is that no matter how good or bad of a service they commit, they're always going to get your money, right? And that means that they have very little incentive to actually do a good job in servicing you, or there's no competition to essentially put a check and balance there. So if you and I were going in an anarchist society, if you and I were having a dispute, we could seek arbitration from one of the many arbiters on the market. And well, someone might pose a question where it's like, well, how do we know these arbiters will be fair? And it's like, well, in a free market, if there's a free market of arbiters to like resolve disputes in society, the competition is going to make it so that arbiters who are biased in one way, like all the time, are just not going to be seen, right? Because no one is going to want to see an arbiter who is just all the time biased. And if you don't see an arbiter, that increases the chance of violence, which is very expensive, right? It's costly to you. Like the violence is unpredictable. One, so right, it's like maybe instead of going to an arbiter, you and I could fight it out. But it's very unpredictable for one. That makes it very costly, and it could be costly for both parties, which is just not in the interest not in our interest generally. So that's why we would arbitrate. And because of the competition between the arbiters, you would sort of see this effect where like they would essentially be marked on or praised or lauded in the market in a meritocratic fashion, where you have the arbiters who are proposing fairness or who arbitrate fairly between the parties. They would be the ones who would rise to the top in the market, because that's what most people seeking arbitration would want, right? They don't want to risk being biased, because like even if an arbiter might be biased in your favor, that's going to lower the chances that people are going to see that arbiter generally, and they'll likely go out of business. So
Wow.
we already have this in some sense. Most companies who have contractual disputes with each other do not go to state courts; they go to private arbitration. So this type of thing exists right now. It's just because the state always gets your money. Most people just think it's generally better to go to state courts, but that's kind of changing over time.
Wow. I mean, competition really is why we got to where we're at. And
Yeah.
because, the most technological advances came from competition.
Yes.
Look at the space race. Look at, I mean, that's the first thing that comes to mind. We saw
Hmm.
Sputnik and they're like, holy shit, Russia's spying on us. Like, we got to step up our game.
Right, exactly. And it's like all this technology we have comes from, people competing. There's a demand in the market, and then the competition, what competition does is it ensures quality, right? It doesn't guarantee it necessarily, but it ensures
Right.
the best chance at quality. Because you're right. Like if there's one dentist in your town, the dentist technically has an incentive for all your teeth to like just fall out and rot and
Hmm.
whatever, because he's the only one in there. And if that happens, they're all going to go to him, and there's going to be a lot of money. But if there's another dentist saying, "Hey, I'm going to make sure your teeth don't rot," then that dentist now is to be like, "Oh crap, I need to actually bring something more to the table than just letting chaos happen," and things like that, right? So competition really is the essence of true checks and balances. Because when people talk about checks and balances for the state, the problem with these checks and balances is that they're internal, right? You're asking the state to check itself. I always say the Constitution is like the conservative equivalent of a gun-free zone sign, right? Because the
Hmm.
very people who are interpreting, the very people who that document is supposed to restrict, are the same people who have a monopoly on interpreting and canonizing their interpretation of that document and enforcing it. So you're basically asking the government not to do bad things. That's ultimately what the Constitution is. Um,
Right.
um, so there's no real the checks and balances in the Constitution are only ostensible. It's saying, hey, wouldn't this be great if it worked like this? But there's no actual checks and balances besides for like people revolting, which the state can't push too hard, or revolutions happen. That's generally been the most secure check and balance against states throughout time.
Well, Biden just said a mini revolution is coming if SCOTUS rules in a way that
Hmm.
is unfavorable to the screeching left. I mean, who knows what that means? Sounds like he was threatening SCOTUS, to be honest. It's kind of
Yeah.
frightening. But I love this idea of
Yeah.
competition in all things. We
Yes.
need that. It's so we've slipped into this. Well, Walmart has everything, so we'll just go to Walmart, and then you don't
Right.
realize how you're giving them all this power, and then that's just Walmart for one example. Think about all the other corporations that
Yeah.
have that.
And also you have to think about, right, there's an economic principle called the seen and the unseen, right? We can all see that Walmart exists, and that they do deliver really for the price, they do deliver fairly quality products for the price that they are.
True.
But But what you don't see necessarily is all of the companies that would exist had the state not regulated them out of existence, right?
Mm,
You don't you what you can't see is like how much better the market might be at producing quality products right now, because all of the competition that could keep these corporations in check don't exist because of government regulations. And to the point about competition generally, right? You can always say it like this. If you understand the state, it would be very bad for the state to be the monopoly producer of clothes, right? Because and if you have a monopoly on there's only, let's say there's only one company or there's one institution in society that can make clothes, and no one else is legally allowed to compete with this institution. We would all understand that the state ultimately, or this institution, would have no incentive to make good clothes, because everyone
right.
would have, if people wanted clothes, they would have to go to that. So you would get shitty service. People would not want to, people would, there'd be no incentive for this institution to treat the customers good. Well, if you understand that the state, it would be bad for the state to have a monopoly on clothes or food or automobiles, you surely, there's a good sense in which you don't want them in charge of your security or laws either, because
Good point.
the exact same incentives for monopolies applies to the state, right? That's the exact same. It's like, well, the police are always going to the police get your money even when they stand outside of a school and let children be murdered and hold the parents back. They're still going to get that money from you no matter what. There's no incentive for them to actually improve their service whatsoever on the market, which is something you would, if you had a security service in anarchism that just stood outside. You had like parents or people paying security for a school, let's say, and the security guards just stood outside while children were murdered. You can certainly expect that people would unsubscribe immediately from that service, and
Right.
a competition would arise, and they'd be like, the competition would have an incentive to say, we will never let this happen. And you would, that would be a real-time check and balance against bad behavior. And that's what the market ultimately does, and that's what it's great at.
Well, school choice is kind of like
Yeah.
doing that. You get to choose where your tax dollars go, and it's
Yeah.
like, I don't want my tax dollars going to this school. I'm going to choose to take my vouchers and go it over here. Which
Mhm.
now I'm starting to understand a lot, especially with this conversation, why the system is fighting it so much.
Yeah.
I do know that the largest union is the teachers union in the
Yeah.
country, and they want that money, that because
Right.
they're getting that money whether their teachers suck or not, which a lot of them
Exactly.
suck, and they're
Exactly.
indoctrinating kids. It's like, well, whatever.
Yeah.
What choice do you have? It's
Exactly.
we're getting your
Yeah.
money.
That's
Wow.
exactly it, right? Because it's like, if you, it's like, no, the last thing like a big corporation wants is a truly free market, because then they're being attacked from all sides. They have to really, they have to put in the most amount of effort possible to remain in good standing with like the community they're in.
Yep.
And the same goes for all institutions when they have a monopoly. If you have any institution that has a monopoly on a certain service, if you try to strip that away, they're going to react, very aggressively to try to retain that monopoly, because obviously you're going from a state where it's like, I'm getting all this money, I can put in the least amount of effort possible, and I'm getting the most amount of gains, because obviously if people want X service and I'm the only one who can provide X service, then I have no incentive to do anything more than the least amount possible. And that's ultimately the largest failing of monopoly. And the state is obviously a monopoly on arbitration, security, and legal services in general. So you can imagine how those incentives would apply to what I consider to be probably the most important social institutions possible. And
Right.
that's, I think, why there's so many problems that we see today.
Wow. That's that's really thought provoking, and eye opening, because when you really think about how broad that affects how many different institutions, what
All
you
of them.
just yeah, exactly, all of them, every single thing. You look at all the different companies that used to be, and then now Coca-Cola owns that, Disney owns that. I mean, it's
Right.
all they all did is buy their competition. Oh, you didn't go under? Well, I'm just gonna buy you. So now I'm solidifying my monopoly and
Right.
getting rid of competition.
And because there's so little way, there's such a little such low possibility of competition actually arising, because it's very hard to actually start a business, especially in some areas, to the point where there's no competitive threat to any of these corporations. So they're able to amass all this like power when normally they would not be able to amass this power, right? Obviously, a lot of these companies like Amazon, Walmart, they eat up a huge amount of the total market share, and that's exactly because they exist within a captive market. They don't exist within a free market.
Right.
So and they have an institutional incentive to remain in a captive market, because most of the market share goes to them. Just because that's the way the system is set up at the moment.
How do we move towards competition? How do we move from where we are now towards that? Because I
Mhm.
feel we need that as a society
Oh yeah.
to further ourselves. Like we're stagnating right now. And I feel like we need to return competition and get rid of these huge monopolies.
Mhm.
It's a problem. Can
Yeah.
we? Is it too late?
No, I don't think it's too late, but I think it's one of those things where it's not going to happen overnight, right? It's one of those things where it's like it was a very long process to get here, so it's probably going to be a very long process to get us out of this, or unless it just collapses, right? Which is also a possibility.
What does
Um,
that mean? What would a collapse look like?
well, collapses don't look good. It would be probably a form of economics, right? An economic collapse. I think. I think the idea that if the dollar collapsed, you would have very bad ramifications in society. Or if the dollar got in, which is happening, the dollar being inflated to such an amount where everyone's savings are gone. That's a very bad recipe for not just revolution, but also just chaos in the worst sense of the word. That'd be very bad. And historically, the dollar has lost, I think, 100% of its buying, or 97% of its buying power over 100 years. It's
Wow.
something awful.
And they
Yeah,
printed 80% of all the bills in the past 2 years, which is
yeah.
do you
So
think they're doing it on purpose? Do you think there's someone out there that are like, "Let's keep inflation going. We want these people owning nothing."
I think there's probably certainly absolutely a segment of the people who are absolutely are doing it intentionally. I think that some people are like just unintentionally doing bad things because they don't know any better. But I think there is certainly a segment of people within the state, certainly, who do understand the ramifications of this and who are doing it willingly.
Yeah.
And I certainly think, as far as decentralization goes, because that's ultimately how you get competition. Um, I think getting investing money or investing things into different types of currencies, like Bitcoin, is one example, where that Bitcoin cannot be inflated by just the nature of how it works. Things like that, alternatives. I think that is probably the safest, the way people can be the safest economically with their savings. I think another way people could you could like sort of get competition going is probably just like um if you so there's one concept where known as like counter economics, where this idea that you're going to engage economically with each other, but you're going to do it in like kind of a gray area, where it's like, yeah, this isn't technically like a legal means, this isn't technically legal by state law, but it would cost too much to enforce, it would cost the state too much to enforce to stop
Okay.
us, so we're just going to do it anyway, right? Things so an easy example of this would be like how many people actually list the income they receive from garage sales on their on their taxes,
Right.
for example, right? It's something like that, where it's like it's not technically illegal to do that, or to like not do that, but people do it anyway because the state
How
just
would they
has
know?
no. Yeah, how would they know? So I think engaging in certain activities like that, certain counter economic activities, like even like doing something locally, like for example, there's many examples of state law where it is illegal to feed homeless people
Really?
throughout the country. Yes, and the example they'll give is that, well, the state has not checked the sanitation of the food, right? It may not be sanitary,
I
but
don't
what
think they
this
care.
yeah, exactly. But what this ultimately leads to is that there have been people who have been, I think in San Francisco or LA, one of the two, um, people have been arrested, put in actual handcuffs for feeding homeless people.
What?
Yes, that's an actual thing. and because of the states, because of, even if you want to assume, well, the state, they just have good intentions, they just get it wrong all the time, which I'm not willing to give them, but even if we do give them that benefit of the doubt, the consequences are obviously disastrous, and this means that more homeless people are going to go hungry. People who are trying to be good people to them, they're going to be punished, and the cycle just continues, right? And you get just so ultimately there comes to a certain point where I think, as far as like creating competition, sometimes, and I'm not advocating this is not legal advice, I'm not advocating people go out and do illegal things, but I am saying that at a certain point, if someone was to start a company, but with not, without getting a license or something like that, and just serving their local community without a government license, I think that would probably be a good thing, and that would help alleviate some of the problems that the state causes with captive markets. So I think working in a community locally and trying to as a business or an entrepreneur, meeting the needs of your local community and beyond, without going through, let's say, the state's regulations, or maybe following them, but only in theory type thing, or only, very loosely. I do think that would probably be a good thing for competition in the long run. And ultimately, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that's part of the reason why they're trying to get rid of a cash society, because if they get rid of cash and you have to use a card, you have to use some sort of an electronic means. Garage sales. Well, here, swipe. I have to get the little insert for the phone so you can swipe credit cards, but then that means it's all documented. And
that's definitely a legitimate worry, I think, because it's it's a good thing, the one good thing about cash, obviously it gets inflated, it's fiat and it gets inflated, but one good thing about it is that it's very hard to trace, right? Very hard to track down, who is, the idea that you could someone could work under the table and without going through government regulations, and you could engage in mutually beneficial arrangements with cash. That's a good thing. But I think ultimately the best hedge, as I said earlier, is probably Bitcoin. I think Bitcoin is probably the future in that regard.
Bitcoin, I actually had, I forget his name. His last name's Breedlove. Great guy. Really good conversation about Bitcoin. He was incredibly knowledgeable. He was explaining, the blockchain technology, and then how there's actually an end point. Like eventually all of the Bitcoin will be mined, and then that's it. You can't print more. It's because it's
only 21 million. Yeah, 21 million Bitcoins in existence ever.
So it's kind of like, well, that's it. My question with Bitcoin is say a solar flare hits us, all of our electronics go out.
Well,
how you trading Bitcoin?
If a solar flare hits us, I don't think cash is going to be a big deal either. You know what I mean?
That's a good point.
We're going to have a lot bigger problems if a solar flare hits us.
Food will be the money. Food will be food and water. Yeah,
exactly. So I don't think cash would even be a consideration at that point.
That's a good point. That's a good point. Well, what about all the other cryptos? Is Bitcoin the one true crypto, or
I think so. I genuinely think so. Yeah, because I think
so many of them out there.
I think a lot of crypto is a scam. I think a lot of people get into the crypto market to scam people who don't know any better.
Yeah,
I think the main thing with Bitcoin ultimately is its non-inflatability. That is the most important part of it, in my view, is that there will never be more than 21 million, and there can never be some central actor, right? Because it's ultimately not centralized. There's no one central person controlling it. It's ultimately, in some sense, it's anarchism in process, right? There's no one central figure who has control of the entire system. It's just people on nodes, or nodes interacting with other nodes in a voluntary process, and that is ultimately what I would see as anarchy. So that's and the fact that it can't be inflated, that means that people can save for the future and trust that it's actually the value will be retained. So that's good.
We've seen Bitcoin skyrocket. It was $60,000 one month, and then it dropped down to 20 something. I don't follow it too closely, but I remember people talking about it constantly, oh, it's going through to the moon. That's Dogecoin, but still, that's kind of a phrase. But then it would drop, and everyone's like, oh, I just lost X amount of dollars on Bitcoin. It's
Yeah.
Well, what about that? It's
I
still, the
think
value still fluctuates.
Yeah, the value is still fluctuating, but I think that's mostly because it's still fairly new. Like it's a fairly new currency. But I
Okay.
think the more and more that people get on board with it, the more and more people who see the value of it, the utility of it, that it can't be inflated. I think that you'll eventually see the value of it rise, like go up and up and up. I think generally, like oftentimes, if a new currency is introduced, it's not just going to go up. You're going to have dips, but ultimately, like Bitcoin has it dropped, but it's never gone like really low like it was like 5 or 10 years ago, right, when it was
Right.
new. So even its biggest drops are still a gradual like in upward incline compared to where it was. You know what I mean? So
Hmm.
even though you see these fluctuations, there's still a gradual, like if you peer out all the way, there's still a gradual incline upwards in terms of its value.
What do you think of El Salvador? Is that who made
Oh,
Bitcoin their
yeah.
main currency?
Yeah, they made it their main currency. Yeah, that's interesting. I definitely think. So I think this is often like a lot of Bitcoiners will like war game this, and they'll say that this is actually like this is the state essentially making it like their last ditch effort, because a lot of these countries, a lot of these governments have existed on fiat, and especially with like the America being like the gold standard, like the with the dollar,
Well, we
the
were.
more well, yeah, exactly, yeah, in quotations, the gold
Yeah.
standard. But basically, because of that, because it's fiat, it's backed by nothing. I think more and more countries are going, I think El Salvador in particular, I think governments are going to see that, oh, we can't stop this, so the best thing we can do is try to adopt it ourselves and try. Now I think this is ultimately not going to, it won't work out for the state in the end, but I think this is probably like a Hail Mary for them in some
You
sense.
you said something just now that, fiat is like isn't backed by anything, right?
Yeah.
Because it used to be backed by gold. What's
Right.
Bitcoin backed by?
The system itself, if well, it depends on, do you mean like what gives it its value, or like what, or like because
Yeah, I
Bitcoin,
guess so, right? I mean, that's
well,
what like the dollar used to be based on gold. Now it's based on air.
right,
Uh,
well, I would say it's based on its scarcity, and it's based on the fact that it's something that cannot be inflated away, right? The whole idea with fiat is that we're going to, by law, we're going to make these pieces of paper tender, right? We're going to say that this is what this is legal tender.
you don't have to carry
This is
around gold. That's
right,
basically what
exactly,
it was originally.
exactly. Right. So basically, with Bitcoin, it's backed by, in some sense, the scarcity of Bitcoin is backed by the trust that you can count on this to not be inflated by malicious actors in the future, and that this can hold value over time.
Mm,
That's in my view, like ultimately like what people would ultimately value it for, because like in some sense, you, with money, you want a medium of exchange and something that can hold value over time, right? So that way you can invest for the future, you can
right.
plan for the future. Savings, investments, those are made possible because if the money supply is just constantly inflated, then people are going to engage in what's known as high time preference behaviors, and they're not going to plan for the future. And then you kind of, over time, you get this process where less and less gets built for the future, and people are just spend most of their money in the right now, because they know if they save it, the value of their dollar tomorrow is not going to be the value of their dollar today.
Yeah. And then you think, well, back to 2020 at the beginning of the year, like before really the lockdowns hit and all that stuff.
Hmm.
I think it was most Americans couldn't even afford like a $500 emergency in
Yeah,
1 month. Like that's
yeah,
that's devastating for some people.
yeah,
$500 extra would just throw
yeah,
all of their balance out of whack, and their life would
yeah.
be like suddenly really oppressive. Like, man,
It,
life,
yeah, it's criminal. Like what the Federal Reserve does when it inflates is it destroys people's lives. Like this
Yeah.
actually, like when they inflate the money supply, this it destroys all, or it just chips away at or completely destroys people's savings. Some people, that person who's poor, who's been saving up money for who knows how long, 5, 10 years, so that they can send their child to college, Well, when that money, when the Federal Reserve prints a lot of money and inflates it away, they're inflating away the value of those savings. So
Yep.
to say that the poor person who was trying to send their kid to college now cannot send their kid to college because the money, just their dollars aren't worth as much as they would have been. And now, because of inflation, all these services are going to cost more amounts of money. So it's a double whammy in both ways. It's awful.
So I'm assuming you're going to agree with me here that we should end the Fed.
Oh yes, absolutely. Yeah. If I say what I truly think, I will be banned. Yes, but yes,
Well,
end the Fed.
well, thank you for not saying it on my channel,
Yes,
because I
I
know
will not.
they watch me
Yes,
quite
yes.
closely. I have a super chat that came in that I want to read because I think it's an
Mhm.
interesting question. It is from uh, Eddie Grimm. He asks, "Does Ace consider the Amish and the Memonite to be anarchists?" That's an interesting
Ooh,
question.
Yeah,
You know,
that's an interesting question. So I'm less familiar with the Mennonites, but I know for Amish, I would consider them certainly a decentralized, autonomous community. I think for anarchism, there's certain elements of Amish culture, which I'm not an expert on. So if I'm wrong, please correct me. But there's
okay.
some elements in Amish culture which, like, I think that they would sort of, in some circumstances, they would encroach upon certain people's boundaries if they went against like certain community, the rules of the community, let's say.
Yeah.
But overall, the idea, like, if all the Amish are doing or saying that, okay, we don't like what you did and we're not going to associate with you, which is completely fine under anarchism, right? Anarchism is the idea that no one should be forced to associate with anyone else against their will. Then that's fine. Yeah. So, but I would, in general, I think a stronger case for anarchism is this, in the sense that every time you interact with another person at all, friends, family, and neither side of that equation is trying to dominate the other, that's an anarchist interaction. And I think that's very important to always keep in mind. I think most people interact as anarchists daily and they don't realize it.
I think that's huge what you just said, because
Yeah.
the classic thought when people think anarchy is
Hmm.
people running around taking
Yeah.
people's shit, and it's like
Yeah.
that's not what I've gathered today. It really
Yeah.
is more respecting your boundaries. We're
Yes.
meeting together, and that just feels like a normal conversation.
Right.
When
Yeah.
you're meeting
It's so
someone,
normal that most people don't even like conceptualize it, right? Because it's just
right?
so intuitive. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's almost like the word anarchy. Um, it reminds, what's another example, like feminism, or like
Mhm.
these words that are chosen to specifically kind of automatically insert bias in before you even know about it, because if from what you've explained, right,
Mhm.
all these corporations, all these people that have control, they don't want people to want to be anarchists.
No,
They don't
no,
want
that's a
people
lot.
to realize
The
what
last thing
anarchy really is.
the last thing a corporation wants is a free market. That's the
Right.
last thing they would ever want.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And
So oftentimes, we like market anarchists and anarcho-capitalists get accused of being, well, you're just pro-business. It's like, no, being free market is not being pro-business. It's like, I'm not. No one is pro any single business. We're pro market activity, which, in like, market activity regulates businesses, right? The
right.
competition is the best regulation, and
Mhm.
it's the only one that does not inherently lead to monopolies, right? Because if even if you wanted to say that, well, if there's a completely free market, you could theoretically have a scenario where this one company or business outperforms all other companies in the area, and then within this geographical location, you have essentially a monopoly just sprung up from this because they outcompeted everyone else. That's true, that could happen, but the difference is, because it's not legally outlawed for competition to arise again, if that business wants to remain in good standing, they have to act as if there is competition around every corner,
Right.
or they're going to be in danger of losing that market share again. So
Mhm.
even if you did have a monopoly rise up in a free market, that monopoly would either have to, one, act like they aren't a monopoly, or if they did act like a monopoly, competition and incentive for more competition would rise, and they'd be back at it again. So that's ultimately like the ultimate check and balance against monopolies.
That's clutch. We need more of that. We need
Yeah.
it. It's imperative. Like, Man, the more I'm understanding of what it is.
Mhm.
Now, in the beginning, before we went live, I asked you
Yeah.
about anarcho-capitalism, and you actually
Yes.
said you're something different. What was the other?
Market anarchist. It's
A
not.
market anarchist. Okay.
Yeah. There's not a huge. So there's a difference, but it's not anything, I don't think, foundational. Like there's some of these terms. Obviously, if you ask other people, they might think there's more of a difference or less of a difference depending on who you ask.
Okay.
I think there's some anarcho-capitalists tend to view that these large corporations would be the main social institutions or drivers, and they would be large in the sense that they'd be wealthy because an anarchist or a free market wealth, everyone would be wealthier. That's the claim in a truly free market. So that would include some of these corporations. The market anarchist tends to think that you would see more diversity in terms of firms and ways that people associate and interact, right? So an example would be, you might see things that are more akin to what would be called mutual aid societies, which were these societies in early American history and early history in general, of like how people kind of associated with each other, which is like, if a bunch of people were poor, let's say, and they couldn't afford a single service on the market by themselves as an individual, they would voluntarily pool their resources together, and these mutual aid societies would contract out services in terms of like the whole of the people who are associated with that society, because they pooled their resources together in a voluntary manner. So you saw this historically, and the reason we don't see them anymore is because of government regulations, of course, because there's a story where doctors, right? So this is something most people don't know, and because mutual aid societies were very prevalent in history, and no one knows about them because they're not in the history textbooks anywhere. But there was a bunch of doctors went a long time ago. Like this was very early, like in the Great Depression, I believe, when they eventually just like completely got erased. Which is a bunch of doctors were contracted out to these mutual aid societies, and because there were so many mutual aid societies contracting out doctors individually, this was creating a lot of competition and driving down the wages of essentially the doctors, right, or the money they received, the profit that was being generated from these services the doctors were providing. And these doctors complained that it's like, we're worth more, we should be getting more money, right? So what they did is they said, okay, we're going to create the American Medical Association, and now we're going to monopolistically determine who can practice. It artificially creates a shortage of doctors, right? So now the AMA would also say, if you associate with these mutual aid societies and give them services, we're going to strip you of your license.
Wow.
So that is essentially it's this like corporatism, right? It's this cartelization of saying, okay, only the select people we select can be doctors, and only the people who get certain licenses from the government are allowed to practice. And this creates a very a small amount of people producing the service. So what does that do? That raises the price of the service because it's artificially constrained here. So all of these problems ultimately go down to a restriction of competition. That's what almost every one of these problems, like you see insurance companies are a bastardization of mutual aid societies after they've been existing in the captive market for so long, where they can just jack up prices with no competition or very limited competition.
Wow, Ace, you're blowing my mind right here, because it's such a behind a curtain, everything you're talking about. They don't this kind of information out there, because if more people knew about the lack of competition in what's
Yeah.
going on in the world, like I feel like people would be pissed off.
Right.
Like I'm frustrated, because I constantly ask on my show, like, how do we get out of this mess that we're in? And I know that it isn't just one answer.
Yeah.
There's 1,000 different problems, and
Mhm.
to fix one problem over there, you got to fix like 8 problems everywhere,
Yeah.
and then each of those are tied to all other problems. It's like, it's not so simple.
Yeah.
But competition would actually help naturally start fixing a lot of issues. So bringing back
Yeah.
competition in all things is
Yes.
very important. I
Yeah.
agree. It's man.
Yeah, like for example, like security services, like most people, right, have a very like legitimate uh, claim against the cops because, as we were saying before, monopolies do not have any incentive to treat you well. So
Right.
if like when because the not only are the police a monopoly in a geographic area, but they're a legal monopoly, meaning that you are not legally allowed to do as the cops do, right? There's you can even be charged with impersonating a cop in certain instances if you try. But so because you're not legally allowed to do that, the cops have no incentive to do a good service. They can treat you like absolute trash, and they know they're always going to get that paycheck at the end of the day, no matter
Yeah.
what, right? And if you had a competition in security, if a one security firm was just started treating its their clients like trash apparently, right? We would expect to see that security service would go under or they would lose a large amount of their market share over
Right.
time. And it's certainly something that I think more people will be open to, right? You should oppose I think Michael Malice said this, where it's like you should oppose socialized security in the same way you should oppose socialized medicine. It's the same concept, just applied consistently, because it's the exact same problems with monopoly apply when it's a monopoly in security, law, food, automobiles, clothes. It's the same thing.
Yeah, I like a lot of Miles's takes.
Mhm.
He's probably one of my favorite Twitter follows. He's
Mhm.
quite spicy on Twitter. Um, but he's right. He's
Yeah.
right. I mean, people need to. They're trying to take guns away, and it's like they're not treating the the issues of the people using the guns, and they're also
Right.
going after legal gun owners, which it's
Yeah.
mostly the illegal gun owners that are the problem. Like,
Right.
I don't see there any sort of
Yeah.
a plan to stop them from getting guns. It's only the legal
Also,
gun owners.
there's no such thing as gun control, right? There's either you have two choices. You have gun centralization or gun decentralization, because the
Right.
people going to take the guns have guns themselves,
The
right?
state
So
has the monopoly
yes,
on violence.
that's right. So all you're doing is you're handing over all the guns to the state, right?
Right.
So even if you're
Fuck
someone who
that.
doesn't, yeah, even if you're someone who doesn't like guns or you think they're a bad thing, you certainly don't want the state to have all the guns, right? So on the off chance that if you were just doing like cost benefit analysis, who has killed more people throughout history than governments, right? Like governments have murdered more people throughout
Nobody.
history than any other like institution in society. It's not even close. In the 20th century alone, governments killed close to 300 million people in the 20th century, and
Wow.
those are the conservative estimates. So yeah, there's no more dangerous institution than the government by
Yeah.
far. So the last thing you want are them to have the guns. So, and luckily with things like 3D printing, for example, I think the gun control debate is kind of over. I
True.
think
You
our
can't
side
stop it.
won. Yeah, you
Yeah.
can't stop it. Anyone can get a gun, and this technology is only going to get better and better, and it's already
True.
in a fairly good place.
Yeah.
And because 3D printing is a great example of competition, because now each person can be their own producer of what not whatever they want, because the technology isn't really there right now. But eventually, as the technology grows and grows, people can be their own manufacturers in their garage with this type of technology. And I think that's the type of competition that will really blossom into like a free market. And I think that's definitely something to be hopeful for. But on the guns issue, I think the gun issue is completely over. I think it's just like I think whenever the government tries to pass any laws like this, they're just throwing a tantrum and they're just hurting some legal gun owners. But they're not going to get rid of guns. That will never happen.
Yeah, that's true. Well, hey, I got some super chats I'm going to read. I saw some
Yeah.
questions come in, so I just want to say hi to Eliza. She is in chat. What's up, Eliza? How you doing?
Hi.
Uh, And also Nacho, what's up, dog? It's one of my homies. It's good to see you, homie. I hope your dad is doing better, man. Anyway, Jason Dixon says, I've been blasting your coffee every time Jeremy / the quartering pushes his coffee all over Twitter and Timcast when he super chats and everywhere else. Yeah, I've been noticing that. I just, I talk about my coffee on my show. I have my own coffee company. It just feels weird to like push it so strongly like that. I don't. I like word of mouth slowly building. I feel like the people who've tried my coffee knows that my coffee's good. So but hey, thanks, Jason. I appreciate you. Eliza Blue podcast super chat. She said, "You two are amazing." Thank you, Eliza. You are too.
Thank you.
Bobcat says you have to read the Anarchist Handbook. I don't have it. Tim had a copy of it. I saw it. I never actually opened it though. But
It's a really good collection of like a bunch of anarchist thinkers throughout history. It's definitely recommended.
yeah, I got to get me one of those for sure. Gerald Armstrong says, Ace, have you ever used game theory in choosing between the state of nature and the state? It's quite interesting.
Oh, so yeah. I kind of get what you're getting at. I've never delved into that is in those parameters in particular, but I know people who have. So I'm familiar tangentially with what you're saying, but I've never done it personally myself. No, but but on the off chance, I do think even in a state of nature, right? Even if we were to assume a Hobbesian state of nature, I still think the incentives from having no state at all, even if it might be chaotic, like the Hobbesians say, will lead to better outcomes than having a state itself. And there's also something to be said, right? Is that there's a really good essay. I'm so sorry because I'm blanking on the name of the man who wrote it, but it's called "Do We Ever Get Out of Anarchy?" And his point is that no, we don't ever get out of anarchy because the state themselves, right? States interacting with each other are in a state of anarchy themselves. America and Brazil, let's say, interact as the heads of state, the heads of those two states interact with no government or monopoly above them, regulating what they must do. Right? You could say, well, there's a UN, but the UN is more like, from their perspective, it's more like a voluntary organization that you can opt in and out of. But there's no like central government above all these countries dictating how.
World Economic Forum just released this statement where they're actually going to.
I'm sure they're trying, but I'm saying that there's not
it's
been.
Frightening, man. I don't know if you heard about this. That they're going to like have some sort of joint venture with the UN, and it's like,
oh right, yeah.
No,
it's not for lack of trying, but each country has an incentive not to let any other country become a world government, right? So there are certain power dynamics there that keep a world government very unlikely. But the point is that even governments themselves benefit from anarchism. They interact without an official government above them, like dictating.
Well, that makes me wonder though. So say America does go get rid of the state, fully anarchist. What do we do about China? Say China's like, oh, well, there's no central government anymore. Let's just go take America now, or whatever.
Well,
I don't know.
I'm going to argue that it would actually be easier to take over America when it was centralized than when it's decentralized. So one of the ways is that in anarchism, there's not anything like just analytically that we could say that would mean that anarchists couldn't be as strongly defended as an actual military, right? They might not be, but they could be. You know what I mean? So we shouldn't assume that they won't be. But
who would control the military though?
There wouldn't be one person. It would be like militias, right? It could just be voluntary militias who could form decentralized. So in the same way that I can't tell you who the 100th president of the United States will be, I can't exactly tell you who will run these militias, but I can tell you that there probably more than likely would be like voluntary militias, just because there would be an economic incentive for it, right? People don't want to get invaded. They want to generally keep their person and property protected. And these voluntary militias would, in some sense, be the best way to do that. But to the larger point of China, there's always that quote that you can't invade the mainland of America because there'd be a gun behind every blade of grass.
True.
That is, I think, a very good argument. And I also think that if there was no government on the American landmass, right, and it was just a bunch of like people interacting voluntarily, you had a bunch of disparate organizations all over the place. That would be harder to take over than if China just invaded Washington D.C. and put everything into Washington D.C. and got the nuclear codes, captured the commanding generals of the military, or the Pentagon, if they Washington D.C., the Pentagon, if they captured that, that would be a much easier way to take over and hold America hostage than actually trying to fight a mainland war throughout the American continent, which would be a lot logistically almost impossible.
So you mentioned the nuclear code. So who gets the nukes then?
That is a good question, and that's a question I think anarchists don't have a perfect answer to. But I think that you even in the sense that we can still apply the principle of monopoly versus competition. It's better to have more people. Instead of having one group with all the nukes, it's better to have more people with all the nukes, right? In the same sense, you don't want one country having all the nukes, right? Because then there's more of an incentive that they'll use them aggressively. You also don't want one central group within a country to have all the nukes. But I do think that there's a legitimate criticism that's it's a legitimate worry, and I share that worry. But I don't think it's a unique problem for anarchism. I think it's just a problem of nukes existing, right?
Yeah. That's a good point.
Yeah. So I think in general, China trying to fight a decentralized force throughout the American mainland would be nearly impossible. So it's the idea of it's harder. It would be harder to fight a hydra than an animal with just one head you could kill, right? What I mean? Like that. It's like when everything's centralized, it has a single point of weakness, and you can kind of put as much pressure on it as possible, and it collapses everything else that's tied to it. In a decentralized node or system like that, that's not true.
Right on. Well, let's see. We got some more here. Jason Dixon's for 10. Thank you, Jason. Says, you should always try to talk your way through issues. Speak openly and discuss stuff. When that doesn't work, violence. Violence isn't always the answer, but sometimes it's the perfect answer. Yeah, I always do that. I always open my mind, hey, this is an issue. This is bothering me. I have to talk about it. And if you're not going to let me talk about it, we're going to have issues. Some people don't like that. Now I was going to say something, but I probably shouldn't. But yeah, it's so I don't know. I don't know if I agree with what you just said though. When discussing it, if it doesn't work out, violence. See, I don't know if I agree. That in certain situations, like you said, defensive.
Only if they are going to be violent to you. If you know what I mean.
Right.
If they're going to be violent to you, then yeah, go with violence. But violence is generally very costly, and it's generally not conducive to either party's interest. Generally,
yeah,
in the long run.
Yeah. Darth Call, hey, what's up, dog? Cheers, brothers. Hey, thank you, Call. Appreciate you, mate. Bobcat for 10 says, in a collapse scenario, gold will retain its value as a monetary standard, just as it has across the last 3 major total systemic collapses. It's just too effective as a physical store of value. It's true. I actually play with my silver coin. I like coins. My grandfather, he had a lot of coins, so I'm fond of silver and gold coins. Not going to say how much I've got, but what's up for your imagination? Andre, I don't know how to say your last name, but actually let me bring over these super chats so I can read them a little easier. Give me 1 second. Andre says, what happens when someone gets all the Bitcoin? I don't know if that's possible. Is that possible?
I mean, it's technically theoretically possible, but highly unlikely. It'd be like saying, what if everyone gets all the dollars, right? It's like, well, it could happen, but I don't. You would be stretching the longest stretch of all time to tell me how that would work, like how that process happened.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's like technically possible, but it's like the most unlikely thing ever.
Yeah, I see that. Metastep celebrating 13 months as a member. Meta, thank you so much. That deserves a spin. Let me get this spin in here. He says, so glad you got Ace on. I've been looking forward to it. Appreciate his takes and arguments on Twitter. May have seen my name a couple times. Aborted fetus. All right. That's a strong name there, Meta. Jeez. I prefer Metastep. It's a little more kosher. Again, Metastep super chats. He says, "Oh wait, you You said the same thing. Glad you got Ace on. Oh, wouldn't let me post 13-month anniversary chat because my burner account name. No, it posted. I see it. Maybe it didn't show in chat, but it actually shows me. But then of course I said your burner account name out loud because he actually like spelled it with a bunch of numbers and stuff. So probably to get around the YouTube algorithm. But it worked. Oh, Metastep then super chats again. He says, I didn't see the message because I was in top chat. Oh, I don't know how that works. Top chat. What's the difference there? What's top chat? I don't even. Oh, what's this? Top chat versus. It's not even showing me the options. That's all right. Anyway, Jason Dixon says a gun behind every blade of grass equals 100% in my yard. Well, I'm not invading you, Jason. That's for sure. Sausage Fingers just does a little rock hand super sticker. Thank you for that. And Metastep says, I don't think anarchists don't take humans' natural predispositions for hierarchy into account. P.S. Black Magic says hi. He loves you and chat. What up, Black Magic? Interesting though. What do you say about that?
Well, I think that depends on what they mean exactly by hierarchy, right? Because that word's been used a lot to mean many different things. And so if a person just means that they're deferring responsibility to someone else to do something, like they're working for someone else, or voluntarily subjecting themselves to something, that's not necessarily against anarchist principles, right? So under anarchism, if I have the highest claim to my life and my property, I have the right to voluntarily subject myself to other people. I also have the right to disassociate at any time, but I can also voluntarily subject myself to their.
Well, that's one side of it though, but the other
Yes.
side is the human beings that want to control, that
Oh,
want
I see.
power over others. I think that's because there is those people out
Absolutely.
there.
Well, we wouldn't be in the position we have right now if those people didn't exist, right? So I don't think the anarchists ignore that, because the entire anarchist position is that we don't, like, in the very implicit in the very idea that we're against the people in power, we're acknowledging that there are people in power who got there through means of wanting to control others, right? So implicit in the very act that we understand that, we're just morally opposed to it, right? So in the same way that we're against murder, right? We understand that we might never live in a world, we likely never will live in a world without murder, but we still claim to be opposed to murder. So even if for me, even if there's always a state, that wouldn't change my views at all, right? That wouldn't make me say, oh, well, I guess because we can't get rid of the state, we might as well support it, right? That to me, that's akin to saying, well, we'll never get rid of murder, so we might as well support some murder.
Right.
It doesn't really follow. As far as so I agree that there will always be people who will attempt to dominate others. I just don't legitimize their rule. I don't think that there's a moral obligation for anyone to submit themselves to their rule, even if it might be prudential to do so.
And it seems like in like a true anarchistic society, they wouldn't even be able to rise to power.
Yeah, if you had if we could assert like an anarchist society where everyone was armed, let's say, and you had one person trying to seek power, it'd be very hard for them to get that power unless everyone already agreed, which if everyone already wants to give that person power, then there's not much you can do to stop it anyway. But under your point, it's like, and if we assert an anarchist society where everyone in the community is armed and willing to defend their rights and the rights of their neighbors and all that, the idea that one person is going to come in and say, I now have the right to rule you, that person's probably not long for the world.
Right.
So it's like, I think there's an asymmetry where, like, once you decentralize, it's much harder to re-centralize, right? It's much harder to, once you've broken the ties of the state from all these institutions, it's not that that people will ever stop trying to centralize power, but I think they're going to have a much harder time in a truly decentralized free market to do so.
Well said. Drea D says, love Ace on Twitter. Excited to hear more. Well, I it's been a great episode. And Ace, honestly, this episode was just talking about you and what you
Mhm.
believe and all this great information. But if you want to come on again and talk
Oh, I'd
about
be happy to.
just the daily news, because that's kind of what I do normally, unless
Mhm.
I'm doing an interview, you're always welcome back.
Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, I'd be happy to.
Awesome. I got one more from Jason Dixon. Says, "Good sir, spin the UFO just for me and only me." All right, Jason. You know what? No, that's not a big enough super chat. It's got to be a significantly larger super chat than $2. But I will spin it, Jason, and it is for you. But anyone can look at it. All right, or it's got to be for a good occasion. And just saying it. All right. Now I know that you are one of my longest supporters, so but I have to deny you, Jason. I'm sorry. All right, but I'll give you a ring of the bell that you got me. This is actually a bell, like an antique hotel bell that he got me. So, anyway, thank you, Jason. And Ace, seriously, this has been a pleasure. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, yes, absolutely. It's been my pleasure. Anytime I get
Definitely,
to
definitely.
talk about this with people, it's always exciting for me.
Yeah, I mean, based on what I've learned, I think more people need to hear about this stuff. So,
Yeah.
yeah,
I,
thanks
I
for
would
coming on.
recommend I would definitely recommend people just some like little reading material if people are more interested. I think Anatomy of the State by Murray Rothbard is generally the primer what people should start with.
Yeah.
I also think there's a couple essays called by John Hasness, who's a professor. He talks about the obviousness of anarchy, which is I think one of the best essays on anarchism ever.
Okay.
It just shows you how in your practical everyday life you are engaged in anarchism all the time, and most of the social norms that we experience arise not from the state but from just like people interacting voluntarily over time, and they're generated spontaneously in an orderly fashion. And then
Yeah.
you have another essay of his called The Myth of the Rule of Law, where he shows that even in a centralized state that has supposedly has a single rule of law, there's always going to be competing viewpoints, and a single objective rule of law is impossible, because there's always going to be different interpretations, and sometimes those interpretations aren't even wrong. Sometimes the laws are just written so ambiguously where you can legitimately infer two actual different interpretations from the law. So I think those are very good. And one last one, I think, for people who have objections to maybe some of what I've said, are Libertarian Anarchism 10 Responses to Objections by Roderick Long. Those he goes through 10 the 10 most common objections to anarchism, and I think he thoroughly defeats them. So that's one I would definitely recommend.
Nice.
Yeah.
Eliza actually just did a quick super chat. Well, let me read Jason's. He said, "I am the first supporter." Yes, yes, you are, Jason. Yes, you are. Eliza said, "Can Ace talk about the war on drugs and Ross?"
Yes, absolutely.
Sure.
So the war, I'll touch the war on drugs first because that'll lead into Ross. The war on drugs is essentially the state claiming ownership of your body, right?
Right,
They're saying
makes sense.
you're not allowed to ingest these substances into your body, right? And no matter what you think of drugs, the fact that the state says you're not that these drugs are illegal, what does that do? That drives up the price of drugs, right? Because now there's going to be less competition in producing the drugs, and that incentivizes cartels and very bad people who get into the market, who are willing to do very violent acts and harm people in through the drug trade process. It's a completely
And giving big
good.
pharma a big old
That's right.
price
Yeah.
jump.
That's right. Yeah. If you get caught with weed, there's a good chance you might be locked up for like 10, 20 years in some cases, especially a while back. But big pharma, if you take, as long as it's state sanctioned, you can, take meth, and
Right.
stuff like that. So the whole thing doesn't really make sense. But yeah, the war on drugs, and we learned nothing from prohibition apparently, because obviously the most violent period in American history was prohibition. As far as violent domestic crime, prohibition, it's never been topped as
Wow.
far as domestic crime goes. And that's because because that's when there was actual gang warfare in streets, and it was a commonplace thing, right? So when you restrict drugs like this, obviously it incentivizes cartels to come in, and they benefit from, much like corporations benefit from being in a captive market. cartels and all these drug cartels in like Mexico, for example, benefit from drugs being illegal. If drugs were completely legalized tomorrow, competition would rise up, and then these cartels would lose all the monopolist status that they have in their given area for drug production, right? So if you wanted to really destroy all these cartels, legalizing drugs would be by far the best way to do it. And of course, the moral argument for that is that no one has a right to stop another consenting adult from ingesting whatever they want into their body, even if it harms their body, right? Alcohol harms people. There's a lot of harmful things that we eat all the time that we engage in that harm our body. It seems weird to say that we would draw an arbitrary line at drugs when there's other things. And as far as Ross goes, this is very important.
Well, actually, let me add,
I'm sorry. Yeah.
I just want to add one thing, because people also there's this argument that like if we legalize drugs, everyone's going to start doing drugs. And there was a study that came out in Seattle, because weed is legal there now, like fully legal, and the amount of people who said that they smoked pot before and after remained the exact same.
Yes.
There was no people weren't just like, well, I can smoke it now, like I'm gonna start smoking. It's like, no, it was no change. The people who smoked before just did it legally, and like that was the difference.
Right, exactly. Yeah. So like I could even like grant them, like even if that study wasn't correct, I could even grant them that more people probably will smoke weed, and I would say, well, yeah, okay, but also the idea that most people are going to say, well, I'm going to go do heroin now because now it's legal, right? Some guy who's just gonna it's like, no, that's I promise you that's not what most people are going to like. Most people who have like a normal just 9-to-5 job, that's not going to be their thought process usually,
right? Exactly.
So there's a lot of things that are illegal there's a lot of things that are legal right now that might be fun in the short term and might destroy your life, and people don't do them now. So the fact that drugs might be legalized and there might cause all these problems, it's like, well, if we can look at prohibition, it actually did the opposite, right? We had prohibition didn't stop people from drinking alcohol, it just made it more peaceful for the people who do, or once it was ended, sorry.
Right.
Yeah.
All right. So Ross
Ulbricht, yes. So Ross Ulbricht is a man who is currently serving double life plus 40 years in prison. Ross Ulbricht.
That's a long time.
Yes, it is. Ross Ulbricht, he's a first-time offender, and he's never been in jail before. He's never done anything in his life that would get him into legal trouble, and all of his charges were nonviolent. Not a single violent charge.
2 life sentences plus
40 years
for nonviolent.
Yes. Yeah. So he started a website which is known as the Silk Road, which is a website where
I've heard of this. Yeah.
It's a website where you could hit. So Ross is a libertarian. He believed in the non-aggression principle. So the rules on the website were very much like that. He believed you could any consenting adult could voluntarily buy or sell whatever they wanted as long as no third party was harmed in the process. So drugs were sold on here, but also just other vanity items or like books, other things. It wasn't like drugs were sold and they were a large part of it, obviously, but it wasn't anything like super nefarious how like the media tries to make it seem.
Okay.
So one claim, I just have to address this immediately because one thing you'll hear when you Google Ross Ulbricht is that, well, he allegedly hired hitmen, right? Well, so to give a little background on this, Ross started the site and Ross handed it off, I think in like 2011 or something, but he still like oversaw it a little bit after that. And the administrator of the website was DPR, Dread Pirate Roberts. And the whole idea behind Dread Pirate Roberts is that it's a moniker, or it's a pseudonym that you pass down to other people. Like other people can come up and take it, and all that. And allegedly, there's a chat log that the feds essentially say that this is Ross hiring hitmen to put out a hit on someone who's trying to extort him for money. Well, the only proof we have of this is the chat log, which we don't know the veracity of. And we also there's no evidence to suggest that Ross was that DPR. In fact, we know there's multiple DPRs in this case, and the state only allowed evidence to purport that there was only one, which they would try to claim was Ross, which that's just not true.
Wow.
And so Ross and Ross didn't himself sell any drugs, right? Ross just made the website where drugs were sold, and this gave him the kingpin charge, right? So it's like it's just like unconscionable, like what happened. Like the people who actually sold drugs on there. Like I'm not in favor of any people trading drugs going to prison, but the people who actually did trade drugs on there got like 10 years, and Ross got double life plus 40.
That's crazy.
Yeah. And it gets even worse too, because here's the thing: people often bring up the hitmen for hire charge. That charge was brought up at sentencing, or I'm sorry, not sentencing, at his bail hearing. It was used to deny him bail. That's the first thing. The second is that charge never went to trial. He was never indicted on that charge.
Wow.
It was completely they dropped it. He's in prison, and that was never even in the discussion of like in the juror's mind, or no, it was in the juror's minds, because they actually did allude to it during the trial, which should have been an immediate mistrial. But anyway, so he's in prison right now, and he was never charged with actually hiring a hit, which there's practically no evidence that he actually did it. And he's, if nothing happens, if he doesn't get free, he's going to spend the rest of his life in prison because he made a website. And there is so much corruption and tampering in this case. Federal agents were arrested or were in prison for what they did on this case. Like, federal agents stole Bitcoin off the website.
Wow.
Yeah. They made Curtis Green, who was one of the administrators of the website. The feds tracked his location down, because he was like soliciting a trade between two people once when it was based on drugs. And the feds essentially made him give up the passwords. So the federal agents had the passwords to the accounts. So that already puts a lot of the evidence that they presented in a very dubious light already.
Yeah.
And they also made Curtis Green, who was one of the administrators, fake his own death. They coerced him into faking his own death for a little bit. The whole thing is corrupt as hell. Wow. And it's just awful. And anyone who wants to look into Ross's case, because it goes much deeper than even what I said, it's awful. Go to freeross.org, and all the information is there. And also sign the petition if you also care about that issue. It's almost at 500,000 signatures.
Yep, that is a horrifying story. That is really sad.
Yeah. Oh, and I should note, at sentencing, the judge at sentencing said to Ross, after Ross pleaded for low sentencing, the judge said to him, "You have a very dangerous philosophy, and I don't think you've given it up yet." And that factored into his sentencing.
Wow.
So it's a First Amendment violation, straight up. The judge basically said, "Yeah, your vision of a libertarian marketplace is very dangerous to us." And that's basically what the judge said. And it's just when you look at it, it's just the deeper and deeper you go into this case, it's the more horrific it is.
As I said, they want anarchy, the word anarchy, to just be evil. And it's it very much isn't. It's the opposite.
Yeah, it's right. Yeah.
It's moral.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, that is I'm glad I know about that. I had no idea.
I'm glad I was able to tell that, because any chance I get to spread Ross's story, I'm very happy. And his mother, Lynn Ulbricht, is
I was gonna say that's Eliza there, yeah.
And his mother, Lynn Ulbricht, is a champion. She goes out and she's always on podcasts. If you ever have a chance to get her on your show, you should.
I would love. Do you know a way I can?
I might be able to. Yeah, absolutely. Because I think that would be an amazing conversation.
Yeah, I'd love to help get that story out, because this is the first time I've ever heard of it. So
yeah, it's awful. But I'll definitely try. But I'll definitely try to get you two in contact.
Thank you. Yeah, awesome. Jason Dixon says, "Can you have Eliza on as a guest again? Love her, of course. Eliza has a seat on this show whenever she wants it. She knows it. All she has to do is say the word. She's on the show. She's been on many times, and she's always welcome back. She's fantastic." Bobcat says, "Ross Ulbricht is factually innocent. Silk Road was an FBI/DEA operation. Is that true? Was it?
It wasn't. No, it wasn't like created by them, but it was. But if he means that the CIA or
Subverted it?
they subverted it at a
Yeah.
certain point. Yes, absolutely. That's
Okay.
absolutely true. And also, there's a copycat Silk Road, which also who was created by a person who wasn't a libertarian and did not have those moral like restrictions on the website. He didn't even get arrested.
What?
Yeah, or he got arrested and then released immediately. So there's a claim, there's a theory, and I kind of hold to it, that the reason that Ross got such a harsh sentencing is that he was one of the first people to really introduce Bitcoin into a marketplace. Like, this was very early in Bitcoin's history, and he is one of the reasons many people who are in Bitcoin will tell you, I am in Bitcoin because of Ross Ulbricht. So he
kicked the first, like, he started
exactly.
the snowball down the hill.
Right. Yeah, he was one of
Right.
the big ones who did that. Yeah, so that's certainly a theory that I think might be very likely as to why he got such a harsh sentence.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah.
Jason Dixon says the government will use Mary J. legalization as an excuse to take away guns. Get a weed card, lose your rights. This happens in many states now. That's true. I actually, I have heard about that in, was it Jersey? There's, I don't remember what state it was, but or maybe it was California. I don't know. If you get a weed card, then suddenly you're not allowed to own specific guns. I don't think it's all guns, but that's
so
weird.
Yeah, that's
It
so
is.
weird.
Like,
yeah, I mean,
you
it just
can
shows
drink
you
alcohol.
They'll use exactly. Like, I always ask people, would you rather have an alcoholic father or a father who smokes weed?
Stoner.
You know what
Yeah.
I mean? A stoner.
Right.
Yeah. So it's like, I think most children would rather have the stoner.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Just gonna make better treats, probably.
Yeah.
The Meep Kid for $20 says, I would like to make a claim. There are more death today because of drunk driving than the Prohibition era. Well, he didn't say deaths in Prohibition era. He said domestic violence.
Yeah.
Just like violence in general. That
Right.
doesn't mean death. And I didn't assume it to be death. So,
Right.
But thanks for the super chat, Meep.
Yeah, I would also say to that, people also drove drunk during Prohibition too, right? So like, people like Prohibition, people still drank. They just got their alcohol through illegal means, right? Just like how people still do drugs, even if drugs are illegal now. So while I agree that drunk driving is a problem, it's not the consumption of alcohol itself, right? Because so the argument is kind of like, well, I don't know if he's arguing to restrict like alcohol, but I think he's just like making a point. But sometimes people will argue that, well, we should restrict alcohol or drugs because people could get in a car and drive recklessly, right? But it's kind of like saying, well, we need to restrict guns because people could, misuse them. Right. So I don't think that's a strong argument.
That's what they want.
Right.
That's exactly what they say.
Yeah. I don't think it's a good argument to restrict guns. And just like, I don't think it's a good argument to restrict drugs or alcohol.
Yeah, I'm inclined to agree with that.
Yeah.
But man, what a great show. Ace, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you.
We got to do this again.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Adam.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you very much. I'll be back tomorrow for my jam night. It's Friday, and it's going to be a good time. So, Ace, you have a wonderful night, and I'll see you next time.
You too.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Bye, guys.